The Security Collective acknowledges the traditional owners of the land on which we have recorded this podcast and pay our respects to their elders past and present. The Security Collective podcast is recorded and shared with you in partnership with LastPass, the leading password manager. LastPass enables companies of every size with the tools necessary to secure and centralise control of employee passwords and apps. You can learn more about LastPass at lastpass.com. Hello, I'm Claire Pales and welcome to the Security Collective podcast. In Season 10, we've once again partnered with LastPass to bring you a live webinar. This time we spoke about supply chain risk. As is often the case, the live recording was too big for one episode, so for the next 2 weeks we'll be sharing with you the webinar recording. This season I was joined by Alla Valente and Vijay Krishnan. Alla is a senior analyst at Forrester serving security and risk professionals. She covers GRC, third-party risk, supply chain risk and contract lifecycle management, strategy, best practice and technology. Alla has a BA in English from Hofstra University and has completed the business analytics program at Harvard with distinction. I was also joined by Vijay Krishnan, who's a good friend of the podcast, and he leads UniSuper's information security function, including a multi-year security program to reduce UniSuper's risk and protecting UniSuper members. Previously, Vijay was leading information security at Transurban, accountable for IT and OT, including accountability for PCI DSS. In today's first half of the webinar, Vijay and Alla share their insights on supply chain security versus third-party risk. Vijay covers APRA's CPS 234 and the need for effective security controls, not just compliant ones. We also cover the role of legal and procurement in the third-party assurance process. There's a ton of great insights to be gleaned from both Alla and Vijay in this ever-present risk. Please enjoy part 1 of our supply chain security webinar recording. So third-party risk, third-party security, supply chain security, whatever you want to call it, is a hot topic at the moment and certainly has been for the last couple of years, and I don't think it's going anywhere in a hurry. So I thought we might kick off today by asking you, Alla, what is the difference? Third-party security, supply chain security, are they the same? People use this term interchangeably. What are your thoughts from an industry analyst perspective on the terms that people are using to describe this type of risk?
There's 2 things to unpack, I think, with that question. The first is the variation of nomenclature, and you're absolutely correct. Some organizations refer to it as third party, some call it supply chain. What we find here is that in the US especially, because of the regulatory requirements, the OCC regulations, financial services, banks, insurance companies, they tend to refer to third parties. However, healthcare organizations will call these third parties, they'll refer to them as business associates just to comply with and be more aligned with HIPAA regulations. Then you have manufacturing organizations and those with physical supply chains that like to refer to them as suppliers. But wait, there's still more, because then there's this whole group of organizations that refer to vendors. And those vendors are primarily service providers, software technology vendors. And for a large period of time, because of compliance regulations, organizations needed to assess their IT vendors, their security providers. And for many organizations, their third-party risk programs are still very much focused very narrowly on that vendor piece. But the second piece I want to talk about is this security. So we know about information security, but that's not the only security area that organizations need to evaluate. There's also physical security, which is becoming much more relevant, especially as we see the convergence of IT and OT. But then there's also supply chain that's part of the software supply chain. So we all remember the devastation after Log4j and SolarWinds. Now we're getting into a software supply chain, and all of these things are unique and distinct and different.
And I certainly think that some of that confusion doesn't make life easy for either side, whether you're or not you're the person who's asking for your supplier to give a questionnaire about information security controls, or you're on the other side trying to work out what on earth you should be asking your third-party suppliers. Vijay, you have been through this recently, well, I guess since 2019, when APRA came forward and said CPS 234, we're going to put some new regulations in place, and third-party supply security became, I guess, part of the vernacular then for information security professionals. Was this on people's radar before CPS 234, I guess particularly for the financial services industry?
I believe so, Claire. Even before APRA CPS 234 came into effect, more than a few high-profile breaches we have witnessed put the security industry on notice and made everyone realize the importance of third-party security and why it is important to ensure that they need to operate with the same level of security hygiene as the parent organization. So, for example, in 2017, well before the APRA regulations came into effect, we had the Uber breach, where personal information of 47 million customers was breached. It was reported that it happened through GitHub, a third party to them at the time. Also in 2018, we had that Marriott breach, if you recollect, where the personal information of 500 million guests were exposed. It is reported in that event that it happened through that Starwood Hotels acquisition, which goes to show the importance of security due diligence during acquisitions and mergers. Also in 2019, Facebook was breached, exposing 540 million Facebook users' information. It is widely reported a third party was involved. Also, the industry-based regulations like GDPR, well before APRA's time, HIPAA, as Alla mentioned, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and also PCI DSS have long before specified the requirements for organization on what they need to do to manage their third-party security. So when in Australia, so when APRA implemented the third-party requirements in 2020, it was not a surprise for the security industry, but it helped us to ensure proper investment in cybersecurity and also helped to elevate cybersecurity conversation to the board and senior stakeholders in the organization. So my view was in people's radar, especially the security community, and we always knew there was a risk with third parties and engaging them to deal with their critical information.
So do you feel like people therefore shouldn't have been coming from a low base? Where do you start when the regulator comes and says, actually, we think you should have mechanisms in place to know everybody who you're doing business with, and for some particular vendors or suppliers, we think you should know a little bit more about their security controls and their security approach. Do you think most organisations were coming from a low base, or where did you start, I suppose, is the question?
Yes, good question, Claire. I know we always, we know the inherent risk for engaging third parties. We always, when you join a new organization, always, back of your mind, always think about how do we deal with third parties. So I have a few simple steps because I started UniSuper on a similar journey, and I have a few simple things I followed which I can share. The first thing is a robust third-party assurance program allows an organization to ensure that the data and systems it entrusts to a third party are maintained in a secure and compliant manner. So the key steps here are, first thing what we need to do is conduct a thorough audit of the business to identify all third parties that provide services to the organization. Place special focus on third parties dealing with company-sensitive information, including personal information. That should be our prime focus, right? Because those third parties deal with your crown jewels. Also, design and develop some sort of a third-party agreement, either as a policy or a standard, to ensure consistency while dealing with third parties. Also, ensure appropriate alignment with the procurement and legal teams, as usually the third-party engagement starts with them. It's not the security is later. So I would recommend preparing a security assessment questionnaire by clearly specifying your must and should requirements that the third party needs to comply with. The question must be based on the organization's context. For example, UniSuper is a financial services organization. We have financial information, we have personal information. So our context should be based on that, and also to meet our regulatory and compliance requirement. The fourth point I would encourage is ensure you have appropriately skilled team who can review the third-party assessment response. No point in just handing over a questionnaire and the response, we don't know how to deal with those responses. Don't know to assess the responses based on your risks. Yeah, so we need to have appropriately skilled and trained people to assess those responses back. Also, I would encourage to invest in a tool or technology that will independently assess the security posture of a third party and provide a real-time view on the security posture. As you know, security is a dynamic environment. It's not that you do an annual exercise and you assume that everything is safe and secure. We need to have a real-time view on your third party. So there are a lot of tools available in the market these days to give you a dashboard on where the security posture of third party sits at the moment. Finally, ensure a periodic review of the third party. depend on the security exposure and the risk they manage for us. Ensure you do an annual audit or a off-yearly audit based on the criticality and sensitivity of the information that they manage. So I think these are the key steps with every organization they need to follow to start this journey.
Just picking up on a couple of things that you spoke about, you talked really about this as sort of being a living, breathing, ongoing assessment, but often we have this conversation around making sure our legal documentation and our contracts are giving us coverage. And Alla, I'm keen to hear from you about, is there a point to having information security clauses in contracts? Do they only protect us when an incident happens? When you put these in place, can you rely on the clauses in the contract? I guess in any case, particularly when you just want maybe a right to audit as well. To Vijay's point, if we want to be talking to these organisations about their controls, do we need to have that in the contract? What's been your experience of some of the clients that you've worked with?
I think it depends. There are organizations that will use the legal contract as a risk management vehicle, and that's extraordinary. It can help you significantly. However, something that we see a lot of in the US and even in some parts of Europe as well, where organizations are doing their due diligence after the execution of the contract. And, that's a little bit backwards because there really is no leverage that the organization has to hold the vendor or third party accountable for those security requirements. The other thing is that without doing that type of due diligence prior to even vendor selection, you don't know what those key clauses that could be added to the contract are. So do you need to add more requests for maybe it's an annual audit or some sort of third-party assurance or validation? Maybe you want to have the third party get a certain level of cyber insurance. Perhaps now, maybe the level of risk or their security posture means that whatever the contracted amount is no longer a good deal for you, and you need to change that pricing, because that's what risk management is, right? We don't manage risk so we can remove risk. We need it to grow. We need it to innovate. Like, all of that is taking a risk. We manage risks so that we know what are the risks that are worth taking and what is the proper cost that we're willing to pay for that level of risk. You don't want big risks, low rewards. So when organizations are using that legal vehicle, doing their due diligence, putting in those clauses that not only protect the relationship throughout, but also give them legal standing to terminate the relationship in the event of some sort of, maybe it's a breach or maybe it's indication that perhaps the vendor wasn't really performing the level of due diligence they agreed to, then yes, absolutely, the contract can become a vehicle, an extraordinary vehicle for third-party risk management. But for everyone who's using due diligence after the contract, what is that term? The horse has left the barn. The horse is bolted. It's a bit too late to really do anything meaningful about it.
And how can we rely on the procurement team, for example, to help with that process? What role should the procurement team be playing? Because some organisations, procurement is just sort of a pass-through and it's just really quite administrative. But when we're talking about security and wanting to have the right contracts in place, and as you said, performance of that contract as well, and I'm keen to hear your view on this as well, Vijay, what is the role of procurement when we're talking about third-party assurance?
So procurement isn't responsible for third-party assurance. They're not accountable. However, they are a point of entry for that relationship that can't be overlooked. So we see procurement really adding a lot of value to the third-party risk process if they are using the RFP to also ask some key security questions. A best practice that I've definitely seen is organizations that will ask anywhere from 5 to 10 questions in the RFP about certain security protocols. That's a great way to exercise and identify some red flags that you just want to maybe not consider that particular third party. Another is to be able to, once again, work with the information security, the risk and compliance teams to be able to score the RFP results, but score them through the context of risk. So perhaps this is a great vendor or supplier for us to use. The price is right. What they can deliver works for us. However, there could be some red flags that will make us need to reevaluate whether or not the risks of doing business with them are worth it. In that case, procurement then can add to that risk management perspective, because it really shouldn't be on the risk team exclusively. However, in collaboration with sourcing, with information security, and also with vendor management, right? Because you're working with a vendor or supplier, the contract is up, it might be up for renewal, it might go back to procurement to renegotiate. Understanding how they performed from that security perspective, from a risk perspective, will help the procurement teams be able to work with third parties that are, advantageous without taking on an undue level of risk.
What are your thoughts, Vijay, about procurement and I guess in your experience, leveraging them for the benefit of risk?
Yeah, sure. So before I respond to that question, I would also like to clarify regarding the legal clauses we just talked about before. I think we have to be careful that legal clauses will cover us in terms of from a financial perspective, but it doesn't cover us from a reputational damage or a brand damage. So you got to be whatever legal clauses you put in for the organization, if there is a breach, your reputation is damaged. So you got to ensure that you can't assume that the legal clauses will cover us in that event. Just to take note. And also to answer this question, Claire, so traditionally, as we know, supplier assurance is a major component of any procurement team, where they will assess against, as Ella mentioned, financial risk, insurance, standards, their suppliers, the fourth parties, and also continuity of delivery. Cybersecurity is often overlooked, as you would know. When I started UniSuper, it was not that stringent where it is now. However, the recent high-profile incidents and breaches and regulators like APRA in 2020 have ensured that cybersecurity assessment for a third party is an integral part of the supplier assurance program. The audits we have done on APRA CPS 234, the key areas they explore is how is our third party security managed. They check our documents, records, and also our assurance program. So how the procurement team can help us in this changing landscape. So they can help us to ensure cybersecurity requirements are captured, as Ella mentioned, documented, and the third party is assessed to ensure they meet our organization's regulatory requirements, including safety of systems and data. So they also need to ensure it's not just a one-off assessment, because we always rely on our procurement teams to inform us or notify us when is the contract up for renewal. So we need to have clear indication, clear line of sight in when those contracts expire. And also, we don't want it to subject to just a one-off assessment. As you know, the risk is a daily risk. It happens all the time. So we need to have a periodic assessment. Assessment should be comprehensive based on the impact criteria. So every third party shouldn't be treated the same. It should be treated based on the risk. Do the third party handle the critical information? Do the third party handle the privacy information? Do they need access to our network? So do they need access to our APIs if there are cloud-based systems? And what harm will it cause if there is a breach and data loss? So based on the impact criteria, they should determine whether the third-party supplier is a high-impact supplier or a low-impact supplier. So we have to treat them differently. So once the criticality is determined, the procurement team should devise assurance mandates, assessment methodology for the third party, working closely with the security teams. This will also include artifacts we require from them to confirm their security posture and the frequency of the repeat assessments. So these are the few things where the procurement team, the legal team, and the security team can work together to ensure that third parties, the organization engages, remains safe at all times.
I really like what Vijay said about every vendor needs a contextual assessment. What I will say, though, is very often, and quite honestly, this is internationally, it has been a standard where criticality has been determined based on spend. If we spend enough money with this vendor supplier, they're considered critical to our business. I think that's a misconception and can get us into a lot of trouble. There are some relationships that have a high spend, but they may not have access to the type of data that can be detrimentally sensitive, while you have other vendors that are much smaller, perhaps even a shorter engagement. Just as a best practice, what I usually speak to Forrester clients about is if they somehow have access into your network or infrastructure, they're high risk and they need a thorough risk assessment. If for any reason they have access to any financial information, any customer information, any employee information, or any intellectual property, They are high risk, regardless of how big they are, regardless of what their cybersecurity posture looks like. They can be that conduit that leads to some sort of security incident or breach and shouldn't be overlooked.
And I think that Vijay made a good point earlier too about fourth parties and how, just because the third party you're engaging with might not be a high spend or might only have access to a small amount of data, we don't necessarily always know who they're sharing it with and how they're treating it, which I suppose comes back to the regular assessment. I'm really interested to talk a little bit too about the compliance nature of third-party assurance, and that, we see regulators like APRA and in other countries as well instilling this requirement of compliance. So if you assess a third party and you have a checklist and everybody's happy on both sides that there are controls in place, there's not always sort of the next stage around whether or not those controls are effective. And we're seeing a lot of organisations now go out and get, SOC 2 compliance or ISO compliance in order to appease this barrage of third-party assurance questionnaires that are coming in. I'm interested in both of your opinions on this kind of compliance versus effective security controls, and are we getting a bit caught up in this? I don't know, Vijay, did you want to go first?
So compliance is not equal to security, right? We should all make that very clear. Compliance is a set of regulatory requirements that every organization needs to follow. It doesn't mean that if you follow all the compliance requirements, your organization will be secure. So I would start by thinking about security based on the crown jewels of the organization. So if you know what your crown jewels are, if you know where the crown jewels sit within the organization, if you know who has got access to the crown jewels, including a third party, that's where you need to ensure to apply the security controls. I mean, compliance, it's required, but I would start with security first. So they are not the same. So once you know where the crown jewels are, in terms of your access controls, who has access to the data, where it is stored, how it is stored, including the third parties. If you do to ensure that we have proper controls in place and satisfying to your organizational contacts and the security policies and standards, I think that will be the first start. And then compliance comes later.
Do you feel that if an organisation came to you, if you were the third party and they said, we want you to prove that these controls are effective and that they're in place, what's the level of comfort around that level of audit, I suppose? Or vice versa, if you went to another company and said, we want to see that your controls are effective. Do you feel like some people are uncomfortable about putting that proof or giving that evidence or showing that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like major vendors like Microsoft or Salesforce, they would not share. I mean, you can't do a penetration testing on the organization. You can't ask many questions. All they share with you is their SOC 2 report, and also share with you the list of customers they have. So you have to gain confidence and trust, saying that they are a major third-party vendor and they're secured and their systems are secure. In most cases, that's the case. I mean, they are major organizations like Microsoft, Salesforce, and AWS are inherently secure in how they operate the business. But I think it's more than relying on them. We have to ensure what controls we have. We need to see whether we can, do some sort of a user activity monitoring, their access-based monitoring, do some session recording to make sure your organization is protected. In terms of the security controls, you can't rely more on what they say and what they have, but our aim is to protect our data, organization's data. We need to ensure that what sort of controls and confidence we need to have to ensure that our data is protected. So we need to start from there.
Alla, what are your thoughts about, are we down a rabbit hole with compliance, or are people really, as Vijay said, putting security first?
I will echo everything that Vijay said. For me, compliance is your floor. It's not your ceiling. It's not what you should be striving for. This is your basic minimum viable security program. I'll take a slightly different approach and talk about compliance from a regulatory change perspective. So we often find that compliance requirements will ask for the bare minimum, just understanding how much of a heavy lift it is for companies to get to that level of compliance. But when we talk about the burden of compliance, the cost of compliance, it's not initial compliance, it's change management. Because when something changes, you need to then identify where is the change, what applications, what processes does it impact? What do I need to do to get to that next level of compliance? So if you are managing to best practices, and I'll call them more broadly risk management best practices, right? What are the standards that could put your organization at risk? And you're managing to that best practice level, then if there is a regulatory change, chances are you're already buffered and shielded from it because you're already going above and beyond what that minimum level of compliance is. I had a former colleague who did an amazing presentation about compliance, and he had this one slide and an image with the gentleman on a motorcycle and a helmet on and not much else. But technically, he was compliant because he had that helmet. And that's how we need to think about compliance for third parties, right? Just because they've answered a questionnaire and maybe we ran an initial scan and did maybe a cybersecurity ratings check, it doesn't mean that they're actually compliant, or that as their business changes and their security posture changes, that they'll still be within our thresholds. Compliance, or rather the need to check for compliance, is ongoing. Having minimum controls doesn't mean you're safe, and it still puts your organization at risk.
Thank you so much for joining me this week for part 1 of the webinar with Alla, Vijay and LastPass. Definitely tune in next week when we cover what secure coding evidence you might need to ask for when using third-party developers. We also talk about how to navigate fourth-party risk, and we spoke about offshore supply chain risk. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week. If you enjoyed the perspectives from today's guests, we have more of their insights to share. For more from Vijay, head to our back catalogue and listen to episode 48. For Alla, I'm thrilled to be heading over to meet her next week in person to interview her for the podcast. If you have questions you're keen for me to ask her about third-party risk or GRC, please head to thesecuritycollective.com and contact us. You'll be able to hear Alla's responses to your questions in our upcoming episode 104. The Security Collective podcast is recorded and shared with you in partnership with LastPass, the leading password manager. LastPass enables companies of every size with the tools necessary to secure and centralise control of employee passwords and apps. You can learn more about LastPass at lastpass.com.